coming this evening. It's great to see a big crowd. This is our first program of the season September to May, when we run these educational history programs. So welcome to tonight's Historical Society program. It's the Ravages of the 1953 tornado on Westborough. I'm Kathy Cavalieri. I'm president of the Westborough Historical Society. I'm delighted you've joined us this evening. We have a good crowd. Just a little bit about the society. The Westborough Historical Society was founded in 1889 to preserve local history through research programs and the preservation of artifacts. Our headquarters is right up the street at 13 Parkman Street. That's the Sibley House. It's an 1844 Greek Revival home built by the slave maker William Sibley. It's the only brick house on the block, and the whole block is created in the mid-1800s. At the Sibley House, we house 300 years of Westborough's history. We have a 1700s room, an 1800s room, a 1900s room, and now a 21st century room. And we're going to be opening the house the weekend of Thanksgiving, that Sunday, for the holiday stroll. We'll be open from 1 to 4. And generally speaking, if you ever want to schedule an appointment to tour the house, you can contact us, and I'll tell you how, through our Facebook page or our website, but I'll get to that in a minute. So for more than a century, the Society's mission has been to celebrate local history and bring that history to life through our monthly presentations, Sibley House tours, and special events. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, which I'm sure you will, you can like our Facebook page, Westborough Historical Society, and you can check out our website, which is www.westboroughhistory.org, and you can also become a member through our website. Membership's inexpensive, and it puts you on our mailing list. I do have materials in the back. On your way out, I have a schedule of our fall programs. I have a sign-up sheet if you're interested in potential membership, and I have our brochures. And there's also a poster about the tornado. So check that out on your way out. Let's see. So tonight's event, let me just make sure I've covered everything. Okay, so tonight's event is about the June 9th, 1953 tornado devastation in Worcester, and of course Westborough was in the path. And we have a panel of people who lived through the tornado. We'll move aside here. We have Dexter Blois, is a Westborough native who succeeded his father Paul and his grandfather William in running the Blois Pharmacy on South Street at the Rotary. He graduated from Westborough High School in the class of 1960. Dexter has served many roles in Westborough and used to know just about everyone in town. Hard to do today. Linda Duncan, where's Linda? Linda's in white over here. Linda Duncan is a 1957 graduate of Westborough High School. She was a freshman when the tornado struck. Linda is known as the Pied Piper of Westborough, since she used to parade the little ones from her nursery school down Parkman Street to Memorial Cemetery. For 49 years, Linda has taught organ and piano to 20 to 30 students a year, and she's still going strong. Kris Allen in the center has lived in Westborough for 50 years and wrote its history book, On the Beaten Path. After working in communications for Clark University, she currently writes Westborough's local history column for the Community Advocate. Kris, as part of this, then we also have Les Wilkinson, is a late addition, and Les is a survivor of the tornado. He's a member of the multi-generational family that runs High Hill Farm on West Main Street, and he has run the farm at that location for all of his life. Let's see, Kris will also be reading a first-hand account of the 1953 tornado written by Lenise Krull Hirschberger, daughter of Leonard and Pauline Krull. This account was submitted by her sister Cornelia Krull Hutt, who lives with her husband Earl Hutt in the family home at 140 West Main. And now I will turn this over to Kris Allen.
It's wonderful. It's great to see how many people are here tonight. I just have a question. How many of you grew up in Westborough and attended Westborough High School for a year? Okay, good. But a lot of you are relatively new, but probably not that new. Although it's pretty hard to find people who remember and lived through the 1953 tornado. So we're lucky to have Miss Wilkinson here and others who, a few others I hope. Anybody else here who lived through the tornado? RT? Okay, good. Dexter will be asking you some of your memories later on. I'm just going to do the background, so most of you probably know it. And this background, a lot of it came from the scrapbook about the tornado that Jim Tajan put together when he was 12. Jim, as you know, is a very meticulous little boy at 12 and also a meticulous town moderator and lawyer now. But he gave me his scrapbook that has all the information about the tornado and carefully clipped and pasted. So as you know, the date of the tornado was Tuesday, June 9th, 1953. It began around 4:25 on the shores of Lake Quabbin Reservoir in Petersham, which is northwest of Worcester, you probably know. It whipped across central Massachusetts at 45, 46 miles an hour, and it ended in Southborough in Fayetteville after 86 minutes. So it went pretty rapidly. People dead in central Mass were 94, and 10,000 people were left homeless in general throughout central Massachusetts. And when it hit Worcester, it decimated so much of the city and totally flattened Assabet and Assumption College. The path of it was, of the funnel itself, 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile wide. And it crossed Worcester, then Shrewsbury, and entered Westborough on the Shrewsbury border. Then went down West Main Street and turned southeast, and particularly hit South Street and Charles, Forbes, Ruggles, Baxter, and South, crossed over Cedar Swamp, and ended up in Fayetteville, where it totally picked up and demolished the post office in Fayetteville. There was absolutely nothing left of that after that, but it ended in Southborough. The size of it, and there's different ways of reading this, but one said 40 miles per hour, but then when you read something else, it said nearly 300 miles per hour. And I'm more apt to believe the 300 miles per hour. It went through with a swath of 1/2 mile to 3/4 of a mile wide, and it hit 1/3 of Westborough. 2/3 of Westborough weren't touched. But Orville Witherell, at the time, who was the disaster chairman of Westborough Red Cross, he noted that the phone lines were down, the electricity was off when the tornado hit. So 2/3 of the town had no idea at the destruction that went on in the other third. No cell phones, no other kinds of communication. So that was pretty frightening in itself. The casualties were 6 people were killed. There were 4 at the Aronsons' farm. Sadie, who was Mrs. Edward Aronson, and then her daughter, Sheila Aronson, Charles Aronson, who owned the farm, and a farmhand named Robert Bailey, who had arrived in Westborough only a week before to work at the Aronsons' farm. They were killed by the tornado, and 2 others were. The others were Mildred Pfeiffer, who was an attendant nurse at Westborough State, and Harriet Cahill, who owned a farm with her son on Flanders Road, and their farm got totally devastated as well. In addition, 100, a little more people were injured in Westborough. It was a pretty devastating and horrible time. The other thing that was very interesting, though, is what happened after the tornado. People came together, 200 families were affected, and many did not have wind insurance either. They did not expect tornadoes that year. The property damage were 321 buildings were badly damaged, 32 houses were destroyed, 42 more were damaged. The new constructed houses on O'Neill Drive and Mill Road were affected. So they had those little capes and things that look so charming right now. A lot of them had just been built and they got clobbered by a tornado. More than 60 farm buildings were blown away or demolished. 30 cars were smashed. 23 miles of highway was damaged. And one thing that was quite amazing, 4,000 trees were lost. Westborough looked like a devastated wasteland. Total property damage was nearly $5 million. And we were put under martial law for 6 days from June 7th until June 16th. So that's what happened, and I don't know if you're going to cover what happened afterwards, how people helped each other, but the town came together in amazing ways to help each other build again and to have a home, and it showed what a wonderful community we are. So,
It's Dexter is supposed to go next.
Dexter first.
My recollection of the tornado is quite clear. I had ridden my bike to a friend's house on Mill Road that afternoon where we played ball in his backyard. He had a big backyard up at the top of Maynard Street Hill. And later, after I got there, my father came from the drugstore to tell me about a storm that was coming. And it was strange because the sky was orangey red. You know, some people say it was black or dark. When it first started, it was orangey red, and it was just eerie. So I got on my bike. He said, "Get home because it's a bad storm," and he would have known about it because my grandfather was on the fire department. He was a fire chief a few years ago, and so he would have got the word from fire headquarters that there was something brewing as it was coming east. So I got on my bike and I rode to my grandmother's house, where I happened to be staying. What reason I don't remember, but my grandmother lived on East Main Street, where Downtown Crossing is now. She had a farm down there. My grandparents, my great-grandparents. And so I rode there, and I can remember sitting on the front porch, that they had a screened-in front porch on the front of the house, watching everything fly by. I mean, everything, shingles, shutters, metal of all sorts. It was just, and we had no idea what was happening because we were on East Main Street. The storm was south of us as it went through South Street a little bit and across Cedar Swamp. East Main Street wasn't touched down at that point. And so not until we came in, tried to come into town and saw all the trees down that we just decided to turn around and go back because there was just no reason that you couldn't get through the town right after the storm. And the next few days after that, I spent, and even though I was a youngster, I had my ham radio license, so I had some communication sense. I rode with the highway superintendent. His name was Eddie Gould. He had a pickup truck around town answering his radio while he was out surveying and getting things set up to clean up, to clear the trees and the brush and everything that was blocking the roads. And I would take notes on a clipboard, and then he'd come back to the truck and I'd give him the notes as to what he had to do next or what was going on next. And back then, the radio communications were not as they are today. In fact, most of the radio communications were through the gas company because they had a lot better radio network than the town had back then. But Eddie had a radio in his truck that was were able to communicate to fire headquarters, and so that whatever they were doing in fire headquarters with the gas company and other communications, we were able to get that through. So that's my recollection of it. It was disaster all over. Kris mentioned as it came through West Main Street, I'm sure you've all heard the high school is where the Aronson Farm was that got destroyed. I mean, that was just totally destroyed. As well, when the storm went across South Street, it wiped out all of the Harvey houses. In fact, the Harveys stayed for quite a while in Kirkside. Kirkside is the building on Church Street where the nursing facility is now. The Harvey family had that set up as their residence for quite a while because their houses were not livable in any one of them. Mike can tell you about the back of his house that got wiped out, but it went on to his grandparents and his aunt and uncles on South Street and into the barn, and then it didn't do any damage from there. It kept on going across Cedar Swamp, and as Kris mentioned, it hit the Cahill house, and that house was on Flanders Road right opposite Washington Street. It was a small Cape house, I remember it well. And Mrs. Cahill was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She just didn't make it through. And then on Southborough, and as she said, it blew the post office. There must have been letters all over the place. Anyway, that's my recollection of it. There's other stories to tell for sure, but that's my personal recollection. Although I wasn't that old, I was, we talk about high school, you know, I was not in high school at that point, but was known enough around town, and my parents and my grandparents and generations before them that were able to get by, do well, and the town pulled together, and it's back to where we are today, even in fact, with everybody pulling together for any type of emergency. I mean, we're dealing with that now with the housing crisis. We just was on the news tonight that all the towns are having troubles with the migrant housing. Anyway,
Thank you.
that's another story.
And Linda.
I'm Linda Duncan. I am a townie. In fact, my father was born in Westborough on the kitchen table. And I went through the school system here. And our school then was where the police station is. Most of you know that. And we went 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 grades in that same building. And the day of, I've introduced my husband Jim back there. He has lived all kinds of places where I stayed in Westborough, but he thinks Westborough is better than mashed potato. So the day of the tornado, I couldn't wait for school to get over because I had a plan. I had purchased a simplicity pattern to make a dress. And, you know, you just bought in little increments as the money, the babysitting money flowed in. So my plan was to leave school, run home. I lived on Lincoln Street and the family homestead. And I flew home after school and I got my pattern out and I refigured and I made a list of all the thread, the zipper, da-da-da-da-da-da. And by the time I got to the front door, it was dark out. And my mother said, "Oh, I don't think you better go." And, you know, when I have a plan, you know. So I said, I will run. So from Lincoln Street down to Blankenship's store on Main Street is not all that far. And so I ran in and I need it, and I paid for it. And I came out, and if you remember, the storefronts all had these recessed entrances back then. And guess who was standing there? Sheila Aronson. And so we exchanged pleasantries. I was telling her about the dress. Yes. And, well, she was a year ahead of me. Marshall, her brother, was in my class. So, but we knew each other. So as we stood there, it got darker, and it was just like Dexter said, there was just something eerie about the atmosphere. I couldn't tell you what, but anyway, then it started to really kind of rain hard. So I said, "Sheila, I live closer than you do, that's a hike up to where the high school is now. I said, why don't you come home with me? And she pondered, and so she said, oh, my mother will be worried. And I said, well, I understand. So she went to the right, and I went to the left, and I ran. And it started really coming down hard. So I made it home, and I got in, and all of a sudden, it was my mother and my sister. My sister was she's 8 years younger than me. So she was really very small. And my father was at work, and all of a sudden we heard this pounding. We couldn't realize what it was. We looked out, and it was hailing. No kidding. They were this big, big ice balls falling out of the street. So I stuck my head off the front porch, and I grabbed 3 of them, and my mother's yelling, get in here, get in here, get in here. You know, of course they're going gong, gong, gong on my head. And she, what are you going to do with those? I said, put them in the freezer. Well, if you remember our freezer back then, you know, 2 ice cube trays was it. So I brought them in. I was going to show my father. So anyway, the 3 of us stood in the middle of the kitchen, and this horrendous roar. We had never heard anything like this roaring sound. And we're going, well, maybe a train fell off the bridge. And it was just tumbling and tumbling and tumbling. And I couldn't tell you how long the roar lasted, but it was something that we couldn't identify. And then it stopped, and the sun came out. It was really strange. So we went out on the front lawn, and because the yard, I mean, our neighborhood came through unscathed compared to downtown. But there was debris everywhere, and trash cans and shingles and tree branches. And the lady next door to us, I can still remember her yelling, the Russians have landed! So my dad finally came home from work. I think he was probably at Bay State then, and they walked back and forth. I don't even think we had a car. So we had a quick dinner, and he said, hey sis, when we get done eating, I want you to come with me and walk up to Chestnut Street, because my father was building the house on Chestnut Street, and he had just had lumber delivered. So, so we did the dishes, and he and I set out on foot. Now, when I got downtown to Main Street, I couldn't believe what I saw. The big old trees had been uprooted, and the root balls were as big as a 2nd-story house. It just, you know, it just was like, oh my golly. So we're, you know, climbing and climbing. You had to watch the wires, the glass, the debris, and yada, yada, yada. So as we got up near the Aronson farm, because you lose your orientation because your landmarks are not there anymore. And I went, oh my golly, that's the Aronson farm, flat. So we started to try to make our way up onto the property. The National Guard had arrived, and they had cordoned off the area. And we got as close as we could before they shooed us away. And I saw these 2 men come out with an oriental rug and Sheila's shoes. We're still on her feet. So anyway, we continued on. We got up to Chestnut Street. If you know Chestnut Street, there's a little rise, and then it comes down like this. And at the time, there was only one house at the beginning, and it was the Parkers. I don't know what Parker they were, but the house was flat. The car was on its roof, and Mrs. Parker, she still had the broom in her hand. And we said, what happened? And she said, I was sweeping the kitchen floor, and then all of a sudden my house fell in on me. And then after it stopped rumbling, she said, I could see right out to the sunshine. And she said, I crawled out on my hands and knees right out the front door and onto her lawn. And she was still holding her broom. So anyway, we checked out our property. Obviously the lumber was all gone. And my last recollection was we made it home. It took some effort. And I don't know, some of you townies probably know Nancy Broderick, Berquist, thank you. Nancy Berquist, who was a teacher in town for many years. Well, we had the best neighborhood up on Lincoln Street, hide and seek, and just, we were always outside. And so anyway, her mom was a single mother with the 3 boys and Nancy. And so she had called my mother and she said, I'm afraid to stay alone tonight. Could Linda come over? So, I mean, like, I was a big help. So I went, okay. I mean, we didn't know if this thing was going to come back in the middle of the night. So I said, okay. So I went over, and Lucy and I slept in her big double bed, holding hands all night long. And like every half hour, are you asleep? No, are you? You know? And neither one of us slept. And to this day, when I hear the chainsaws, I think, oh golly, that's all I can think of. So, and beyond that, I don't remember much. I probably settled down and made my dress.
So, but it was a tragic memory, you do remember.
Yeah, I do.
Now I have a first-hand account. And it was a very interesting one because I asked Connie Kroll Hutt, who is 93, if she remembered the tornado. And she said, well, my sister Lanice wrote a whole account of the tornado and in 20 years ago, 2003. And they lived at 140 West Main. You probably know it. It's at across from Mill Road, the big house on the hill. And it was built by their father, Leonard Kroll, who was a founder of Bay State Abrasives. And their daughter, Lanice, wrote this. It was a humid, heavy day. I was home from Oberlin, getting ready for a work camp in the summer in Mexico. I was on the 2nd floor, and Mom and Dad probably downstairs. I became conscious of a hard rain, strong wind and darkening. I looked out the guest room window toward West Main Street and saw a black funnel cloud coming through the rain, imminently close. Something I read or learned came to the fore, and I ran shouting for my mom and dad to come with me to the cellar. We started to open the door leading from the kitchen downstairs to the cellar, but the wind was coming up from below, already so overpowering that we had to reclose the door, leaning hard against it to keep it from blowing in. The sound outside was a roar of a train underground, the house seeming to shake in the fury of it, growing darker, and a smell of ash. In barely a minute or two, it was over. Dad worried about fire, but as we left our post and made our way into the living room, he saw that the ash clouding came out from the chimney. The windows were totally obscured by leaves and branches. Dad started opening windows one by one. Quote, "Mom, the big oak is down." Then he said, "Mom, the little playhouse is gone." And then, "Mom, my new barn is gone." Polly, his wife, "The sunroom is all smashed in, and his glass greenhouse, pieces of glass everywhere." I cannot remember words to describe the feeling of that day. My father must have been simply devastated. But to describe what I remember, the damage. One, the chimney had broken clean through the roof and laid against it, and that accounted for the smell and surge of ash. Our two-story playhouse was splattered against the back of the house in splinters everywhere. And my family, Ida and Al's wedding presents that had been burlap bales ready to ship to California were scattered like newly baled hay all over the backyard. But it turned out almost no damage to those presents except to the cutlery. That's not in forks, I can barely say. Cutlery, which is a great mystery. Dad had completed his dream barn only 3 weeks before, and I don't think it was insured. It had been built over an old concrete slab that had served for a couple of decades as a flat roof over the below-ground barn that housed sheep and sometimes horses. In preparation for full retirement, Dad had fenced in substantial land up Vinyl Hill and purchased goats to add to his sheep herd. The entire new barn was shredded to splinters up to the side of the pasture. And that flat concrete slab sailed through the air and dropped wholly intact to the ground quite distant from the site. The new and old fencing lay in corkscrew snakes all over the ground. The sheep and goats, meanwhile, had apparently had instinctive good sense to hover behind the barn doors, and now they wandered about afterwards unrestrained, and our neighbors called to say our goats were eating their shrubs. Red tiles from Dad's beloved Dutch roof. If you know the house, it's a Dutch architecture that Leonard Krell decided he liked, and that's why he built a house that was very different from most of the homes in Westborough at the time. Red tile from Dad's beloved Dutch roof lay in broken shards all over the lawns. The great spruce and spruces that bounded the house lay in the pasture, horizontal like great dominoes, their huge root structures reaching straight up, but intact. Other trees and fences lay in shambles across every lawn in Westborough, and a branch from one of the great oak trees on the ledge pierced straight through a corner of our Gracie's room like an arrow. I can remember trying to walk down West Main Street. The sky was blood red, as Dexter said, in an unworldly way. Trees crossed the street everywhere. Dad, in the immediate aftermath, called on the Bay State crews to help. They lifted that concrete barn slab up and returned it in place. They, or one of the nurseries, pulled the spruces back up and rebedded them. I remember offering to stay home and help, but Mom and Dad insisted that I continue with my summer plans. So I left shortly after in my new Ford Ranch wagon and headed to Mexico. So that's what Denise Crow remembers about house.
Wow, nice story.
Yeah.
And Les,
You're on.
I really just didn't write this as anything like that. A lot of the things that I have reflect some of the things you said, especially when you were talking about the train. The title of my talk is I Heard the Train. By a 6-year-old kid, aka a 76-year-old man. My name is Les Wilkinson. I've lived all my life in the John Fay house at 172 West Main Street, which the tornado took the roof off but didn't destroy because it was constructed so well. But if you're acquainted with Main Street, where my big greenhouse is right where the tornado came through. The parameters we had was basically down where the Lutheran church is, down West Main Street to where the road going up to the Veterans Park is. And that's what the parameters involved with me and my family. I was at the kitchen table, and my two brothers and a hired man were up in a great big barn we had with 3,000 chickens. And that's where they rode the storm out. My brother was so traumatized, he doesn't want to talk about it. I was 6 years old. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my mother and my father, and all of a sudden it was large hail. My little brother Jim ran outside. I think he must have thought he was picking up eggs because these things were so big. My father said, "Go out and get him." So I ran out and got him. All of a sudden my father says, "Get in the cellar," and he ran over to the side door of the house. And my father was so big, he worked at Bay State for a while, he could put one 300 wheel in that hand and one 300-pound wheel in that hand and walk with him. That's how big he was. He braced himself between the wall and the door, and he said it was all I could do to keep that door from opening. I was down cellar. That's where I heard the train. Oh, an old lady upstairs, an apartment upstairs, was hit by a falling chimney. After the storm, we went outside, and it was the most beautiful day you could. It was just perfect out. And, but except for the destruction, there was stuff everywhere. The house, the roof was gone off part of the house. The barn, half the barn roof was gone. Just then, my father says, "Let's go." He grabbed my two older brothers. My father, who I described as a giant, ran across the street to the Ward Farm. The Ward Farm was located just in back of where the Lutheran church is. The barn had fallen on Jim Ward's father, Lewis. He was trapped under the barn and was freed when my father and brothers picked the barn up. Savitas Ashworth, who lived up in Grafton Flats, probably remember Brian, that was his father. He had a station wagon, and he put that into service as an ambulance, and he took Mr. Ward to the hospital. Even though we were in the center of the storm, with total destruction and all around us, other people in town, like the Aronson family, who's found where the high school is now, people were killed. My father and brothers took our two tractors, one with a bucket loader, which was very rare in Westborough. There was no equipment. And his chainsaw, and he started down West Main Street cutting trees. You get down to the country club and the saw became real dull. All of a sudden he turns around, and Joe Nason was there. And he goes, "Is there anything I can do to help you?" He said, "Yeah, I need my file. It's up in the barn on the shelf." He says, so Joe ran up West Main Street, got the file, and brought it down for my father. These are just little stupid things you remember, or you're told about. And that was an example of how people came forward to help, do whatever they could do. People from our church came out from Worcester to help fix our house. Because my father was a member of the Worcester County Poultry Association, many of those farmers came to help restore the barn. A few more memories. One of our small chicken houses, it's a brown building about 30 feet across, was picked up and carried about 300 feet and was set down, and there was little glass waters in there with a plastic bottom, and they didn't spill. Now, Veterans Park is just down the street from me, and that's where the Dunn farm was. Al Dunn's barn was probably as big as the Baptist church. As you go up the drive, just down the street from my house, to the big barn of Al Dunn's. It was flattened. When you're in the parking lot, sometimes you go up there in the parking lot, just stand there and look out over all those fields. Because all those fields were strewn with litter from Shrewsbury and beyond. Up through all that stuff came right through. We got all that. Those whole fields were all covered with crap. So the 4-H club, which Al Dunn happened to be the leader of, organized to pick up all that trash. And I can remember that.
Unless they were nails too, right?
It was everything. You name it. you name
No,
it.
because they were saying that,
All this trash was put into a giant pile halfway up the drive from Veterans Park on the side there. And it grew pretty big. When it came time to burn it, a lot of people showed up to watch the bonfire. The event was overseen by the fire department. It was doused with many gallons of accelerant. Unfortunately, it was gasoline. And even though 76 years have gone by, when they let that thing off, the whole pile lifted it off the ground. I started school that year. It was a brand new school up here. Didn't have a name then. So anyways, that was brand new. So it came time to go to lunch. So I go to lunch and it's like, you go over here, go over here. I'm in this line over here. And the teacher says, what are them kids over there? Oh, them are the tornado victims. They're getting free lunch. So I got free lunch. I can remember driving around. There were so many farms. It was unbelievable in those days. But the barns were gone and the stanchions are there. And the guys were milking their cows in an invisible barn. I can remember up in Shrewsbury, up at the Bell and Oscar's farm, we went by there, their house was gone, there was a big tent there, and that's where they were living. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And you gotta remember, they talk about all those trees, the wood chipper had not been invented. There was no wood chippers, there was very few chainsaws. And the town had very basic equipment. People could not understand, like that, how primitive the town was. My phone number was 956.
I remember that.
Just last Friday,
I remember it.
it became very weird. And I was glad there was no hail. That freaks me out. The air got to be just like it was that day. All of a sudden, this isolated storm came through, and Sarah says, the tree across the street just took the guy's wire down. It took the electric wire off the guy's house and went right across half of West Main Street. So that closed down West Main Street, but I knew there was nothing to worry about because there was no train.
Very good.
We just have something to say.
There's 3 seats down here. You
Yeah.
folks in the back want to
Yeah.
come sit forward.
There's
There's
three
no
free
reason to
seats.
There's
stand.
a couple over here on the side.
3 seats here.
You're welcome to,
Anybody who doesn't want to stand. Maybe you don't want to be that close to us.
And actually, I could even stand off to the side. I do have a testimony. Can I give my testimony from Robert Moynihan? Okay. So as part of the whole patch article that, or the Facebook page, we received a testimony from Robert Moynihan. Robert is 84 years old. He currently lives in Somerville. He grew up in the house that's next to the Central House, where the Chabad house was, that's currently for sale. His grandfather owned the Central House during the Depression. Then his mother ran it with his grandmother, Effie Stevens. So he was about 14 years old when the tornado happened. And he just gives a brief, recollection. He says there are a lot of memories of that day. He basically says that he was on South Street at Donnie Ayer's house. We were throwing a ball around, sounds familiar. And he said there was no air, no color, it just felt weird. And Donnie's father came out on the porch and told us to get into the house. When we got there, we ended up in the cellar. He just says, when we exited the house by the front door, it was something you'd remember for the rest of your life. And he instructs me to go to Google the Worcester County tornado, and it'll show the damage and how people coped with it. But I think, if you can just imagine, as a kid, he just couldn't believe what he was looking at on South Street, right, 44 South Street. So that's his testimony.
And if you're interested, the poster up at the end are photographs from the newspaper of the time that Jim Tajan lent us, and you can see that the houses are flat. It's really quite amazing.
So we're into Dexter.
Okay, so before we hear comments from the audience, I'd just like to read a paragraph here. And thank you all for attending this evening's presentation. Before we entertain comments from the audience, I'd like to take a moment of silence to remember those souls who perished on September 11, 2001, and those who perished later as a result of injury or disease from the events of 9/11. Also, as we discussed tonight, those 6 who died in Westborough and others throughout Worcester County from the effects of the June 9, 1953 tornado. A moment of silence, please. Fine, thank you very much. Appreciate it. There was a ceremony this morning at the 9/11 Memorial in front of the fire station at 10 o'clock for 9/11. You've all seen what there's been presentations on 60 Minutes and other talk shows on television about it, and it's still in the air. Anyway, anybody from the audience have some thoughts, some comments, some experiences? Bob?
Yeah.
You want to mention your name too, please?
And maybe stand up and just give us your name.
I'll be glad to. My name is Bob Poskett. Some of you probably remember my dad, Frank. His car is still remembered. He was a townie, 98 years, born on the farm, loved everything about Westborough. Some of you remember my brother Tom. He was a year older than I was. He always said he was the smarter one, but at least my mom loved me more. If you haven't seen the book, there is a book entitled Tornado, 84 Minutes, 94 Lives. It's about the Worcester tornado. It's 215 or 240 pages. There's a section on Westborough about the Harveys. Just go into Amazon and Google it. It's a fascinating read. I've read it a number of times. I'm going to pass it on to a friend here tonight. So let me share with you my experience. We talked about Armstrong Elementary. Well, this was the first year that I went to the new elementary school. And I was a second grader on that day in June. Miss Kelleher kept putting a chair in front of the door out to the playground because it was so hot in the room, and the door kept closing on it. So then she decided to put a book on the chair, and it kept closing, and then 2 encyclopedias on the chair. And it kept closing because it was a hot, dry wind. And any of you remember that day? It was a very unusual day. Well, I got home about 5 o'clock, and my brother Tom and I were outside, and we looked up in the sky. And by the way, my dad's farm is at the east end of Westborough, not the fashionable West End, the east end, near Southborough. So we were maybe 3/4 of a mile from Cedar Swamp and Flanders Road, off Smith Street, just on the border with Westborough and Southborough. So we looked in the sky, and there was all this debris up there. It was a lovely day. It was absolutely silent. There weren't any birds, but all the debris. I mean, there were chairs, there were TV sets, there were limbs. And we didn't know what was going on. And then the dark clouds began to come, as you all shared with us. They were purple and green and funny colors. And then the hail started. And my dad told us to get on the porch of the farm, and he went in and put a pillow on his head to go out and capture all the hail. Of course, we didn't have any electricity, and so what. But what was happening at that time, then the storm clouds moved along Cedar Swamp. We didn't get much damage to our house, but we were concerned about the Cahills, the Zarettis, and the Walkups, who were farmers not too far from us. So right after that, we actually first went downtown. My grandmother lived on Myrtle Street, which was about 3 blocks from the Harveys. Utter devastation there. I remember when we went down to the Harveys and looked around, There were a lot of people there, but absolute silence. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. Nobody was talking to anybody. They were just looking around. So from there, we went back onto Route 9 to come back to the farm, and we went by the Cahills. Now, my dad was a farmer. The farmers were the first largest employer in the town of Westborough. Bay State was number 2. So everyone was in Grange and everyone knew everyone in the farming industry. So we went by the Cahills. Mrs. Cahill was missing. I don't think we knew at that time that she had died. But what got our attention was the holes in the walls of their house. It looked like somebody had taken a machine gun and just peppered the house, because the holes were about 1/2 inch thick everywhere. And you say, well, where did the holes come from? The holes came from the twigs of trees with such a high velocity that they caused those holes in the outside walls. The rest of the family was protected from that flying debris because the storm had wedged them against a freezer, and the freezer had protected them from that. Very, very interesting. I guess overall, the memory that is most significant to me was the Harveys, because Billy Harvey and Bob Harvey were my age and my brother's age. And those 2 boys, and Benjamin, I think, was the 3rd brother, and then there was a 2-month-old daughter. Dorothy. We were down there the night before. My dad had Grange business. So the previous night we had been down there on the porch. And when we heard what had happened, that those 4 kids and Mrs. Harvey and Bob Harvey survived, we still to this day can't believe that miracle.
I was hoping to stand up and tell,
Oh, yes.
I'm a cousin and I can tell the story. When you get done.
No, I am done.
I'm going to talk, you know.
You're not. No, please do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See how good you knew this was going to happen, didn't you?
It's great.
Okay, for those that don't know me, my name is Mike Smith, and my mother was a Harvey, so that's my connection to the Harvey family. But I was not born when the tornado came through, but as you can imagine, the stories built and grew and went on for generations. So I'm going to pass on the stories that I know are pretty accurate. And he brought up my Uncle Bob's house. Bob and Jane Harvey lived at 91 South Street. The house was, it's gone now. They built a new house in the same spot. But the way that when the storm came, my Uncle Bob was, the farm was across the street and down the back of what was my grandparents' house at the time. So Uncle Bob was at the barn, and he and my Uncle Jim were both in the barn with my grandfather. And my grandfather said, there's a bad storm coming. I'm going back up to the house, and I want you to come with me. So the 2 boys, they left the barn, they went up to the house, they came back, and Uncle Bob decided he'd go back down and make sure the barn doors were closed, because he was concerned they had left the door open to the milk room. And that's where the milk tank was, and milk, at that time, that was the money. That's how they were making their living, was with the milk, so he didn't want to lose the milk tank. So he went back down. Meanwhile, up in the farmhouse was my grandmother, my grandfather, my Uncle Jim, and my Aunt Janet, his wife. They used to live in there was a little apartment up above, and my oldest brother, Alan, was in the house. So Uncle Bob went back to the farm, back to the barn, and as he got down there, I know it because I grew up with it. You walk down the barn driveway, and then there's a set of steps that go up into the milk room, and there's a metal railing there. And when he got back down to close the door, the wind got so strong that he grabbed a hold of that railing to hold on, and he held on to that railing through the whole storm. The top of the barn blew off, and the stanchions were still there with some of the cows. The barn wasn't full. There were like 15 or 20 cows in the barn, but the top of the barn blew off, and over my uncle's head and landed on my grandfather's car, which happened to be parked right there. So as the storm settled down, he, got his wits about him. He ran up the barn driveway, looked across the street towards town where his house had been, and the house was gone. The house had gotten blown out into the field between the house that my grandmother lived in when I was a kid. There was a field where Ruggles Pond Road goes in now. It was blown out into that field. The way I understand it, and I think it's pretty accurate, is my Aunt Jane with the 3 boys, my cousin Bobby, Billy, and Benji. Benji was 3, as you mentioned. My cousin Dorothy was just a baby. She was born in '53, so I don't even know how old she would have been. But the storm was, Aunt Jane figured out this was going to be pretty bad, and she said to the boys, all right, I want you to get down the cellar stairs and, whatever. And so they started down, and when they got about halfway down the steps, she said to, I believe it was Billy, but I'm not positive which one it was, go back and get a flashlight. It's going to get dark after this. We need a flashlight. So whichever brother or cousin it was went back and got the flashlight, came back, came down the stairs, went by my aunt, and as my aunt stepped off the last step, the house blew away.
Wow.
Just like the Wizard of Oz. And I guess it was obviously pretty scary. One more last thing I'll throw in on the Harvey end of it, because you brought up the Kirk side. The day of the storm, after the storm was settled down, everybody said that, the other thing was the hail. I always heard the story about the hailstones coming down on Baxter Street. And they were the size of softballs, my father said. They never saw anything like it. And the same thing with the sky, the color of the sky. But of my mother's family, my grandparents, 2 uncles, one of my mother's sisters, and my family all grew up on Baxter Street or South Street, right? We could see each other's houses. And the only house that wasn't damaged was the O'Neill's house. But they had so many children, there wasn't room in that house for anybody else to stay.
12.
Well, at that point, I think there were about 9.
Maybe not at that, yeah. Ended up with 12.
Yeah, there were 12 at the end. But, so after the whole thing settled down, and it's like, where are we going to go tonight? And the only house, the least damage of the houses was our house. My father had built a house on Baxter Street, and the storm had pulled the Ruggles Street wall and the back wall away about a foot. But the house was safe enough that's where the family, all my grandparents, all the aunts and uncles, all the cousins slept on the floor in the house that one night. And the next day, they were allowed to use the Kirk side because Uncle Bob's family, everybody, they stayed up there. But that's the Harvey story that I can tell you.
Archie.
Yes. I want to tell you about Sulphur. That's right. The storm came through. I was at Fable Lights.
Give us your name.
Archie Monroe. And before you go up to Fable Lights is Woodland Road. Everybody knows that. That brings you right over to 85. You follow it up. We're the 3rd house up on the right. My father owned a machine shop. And there was the 6 of us. 3 brothers, myself, and my sister. So at the time, I can remember, I was only 6. We heard the weather forecast from WBZ. That was the only good station around it. We could get at the time up in Southborough, really good. And they kept saying about a storm coming, but they didn't know. So we're just about sitting down to eat, and the hail started coming a little bit. My other brother, Kenny, and David, Kenny ran out, grabbed some hail, came in, and we just started about to sit down, and Kenny backed out, went back out again, and says, and we saw the different lights, the colors of the sky, and he was like, wow, and it's here. My father turns around and looks at him, he said, you're full of bunk. He didn't say shit, but he said bunk. No, he said, what's happening? And it's, of course, father looks out the door, sure enough. So the kitchen's, at the kitchen table, there's an island here, and this is one of the biggest parts I missed. And so my father says, head for the cellar. He's throwing us down the cellar. He's trying to open up windows. Back then, they didn't know which way to look at. Windows up, windows down, because of the pressure. So I'm running down the stairs, they're pushing down, and there was a big freezer. We went down to the corner, there was a big freezer. We were all there, and the storm's coming right at us, and there's a little window, normal sized window, and it just turned completely dark, and the whistle, like you said, the train, it was just roar. It's just, you never forget that noise. And so they wouldn't let me go up. My father went up, my mother, of course, and my brothers went up, and then finally they told me to come up. And my father goes out to the shop. He had a small machine shop there, and it was a flat roof. That was gone completely. So he turns to my mother, and this is, I didn't hear this, but this is the story. I always wanted air conditioning. But at the time before we were just sitting down, my mother took out 2 apple pies on the counter. Well, they made it. There was glass in there. That's my disappointment. 6 years old. But the next, when I woke, they put me to bed. Of course, they were scurrying around for lights, flashlights, kerosene lanterns, and everything. And when I woke up the next morning, it was just bright as could be. You know, it was like a bad dream. That's the best way I can tell you. So I'm scurrying down. My mother's in the kitchen. My brothers are already, I can hear noise out there. They're out with axes and saws. We lived on that house up, it's on a hill. Pine trees came down on the car, knocked all down around the road, the driveway, the long driveway. My brothers were already out there cutting stuff off already. So my mother poured, she's gonna have a cereal. So I poured, she gave me a bowl of cereal and of course the milk. I put my spoon in there, it's warm. What is this? It's warm. Oh, you don't have no electricity, you know. So basically, you think back, but every time I see a storm, even like the other night, I start thinking. I mean, when we have something, I grab things, I go down that cellar. No questions asked, we're going. So that's my story. And it was a good time.
The grass issue in the grass.
Oh, the grass, yes.
They couldn't believe grass.
The next to the house is a big field. They hate it every year. And the house sits up, then there's a stone wall. And about 3 or 4 days later, my father comes. I always played in the field constantly, always in the field. And my father brings me down to the telephone poles to run this side of the house next to the stone wall. And there were blades of grass stuck right in my spears. And actually, if I knew about this earlier, what was going on, I wasn't paying attention. I got old films, 8mm films of all this devastation. Once in a while, I do pull them out. But I remember that, definitely remember all that telephone pole. And like my father said, if you were out there, you would have got speared.
You wanted to eat the apple pie.
I didn't eat apple pie. No, that was my thing. That was disappointing. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Does anybody else? Yes, please, come forward.
Hi. How are you? I came. I'm so glad. Okay. My name is Carol Jolly. At the time I was Carol Andrews. And living on Andrews Farm. I was 19 years old at the time. I just come back of like 3 days before, I think Friday. I had just finished my sophomore year at UConn. I just taken my exams, came home for the summer. And I was in the den in the morning, and we had the radio on, as he said. And they said it was very hot and humid. They said, oh, we're gonna have a storm later, a thunderstorm. Okay, so the day went on, came close to supper time, and my brother-in-law and sister lived with Mom and Dad and I while he was finishing his master's at BU. And he had a friend, he was originally from Shrewsbury, and he had a friend up there who had a garage, and he would help him out pumping gas in the evening. And so we were going to eat early so Russell could get off and get up to Shrewsbury. All of a sudden, we were in the kitchen, and there was this noise and also this heavy wind, and something was going on. So I went to the back, out of the kitchen to the back hall, looked out the window, and we had a huge ash tree down by the street in front of the house, and all the branches were on one side. I could not believe it. I could still see it. It was just clustered to one side, and it was normally this way. Okay, so I thought, wow, that is different. The sky, I will never forget, was a pinky orchid, like my shirt. I have never seen that sky look before or since. It was so unique. And I thought, whoa, something's happening. This happened very quickly. And it was the style at the time to have pull-down curtains, shades at the windows, and the shades started to stand out like this in the room, which were normally flat. And I thought, wow, what is that? And we were all confused. And it just lasted a while, and a noise too, a big storm. And I remember when it went by, we said, wow, that was something. And I remember my father saying to my sister, that was more than a thunderstorm. That was something. And so we sat down, we had supper, and Russell jumped up and off he went, and we said, okay, bye, and we went all cleaning up after dinner, and all of a sudden, about 10 minutes later, 10 or 15 minutes later, I couldn't tell you what, but soon, Russell's back, and I thought, oh, and he said, oh, come press, my dad, come press, he said, Jim's barn's down, and Dad said, what? And he said, yeah, Jim's barn's down on the cows, we need help. And so they went off, and then what happened was, as they explained, the barn, the roof came down on the cows, and the barn door had hit Jim's dad. They took him off in the station wagon. We didn't have a town ambulance then. And so here are the cows, and the stanchions saved them because they were such strong metal that it settled down, but the cows had to be milked. Okay, so problem. Just by luck, my dad did not have any cows in his barn at the time. And he had the milk room with the cooler and the whole 9 yards that they needed. So Dad says, oh, Jim, let's get him up to my barn. So the guys all pitched in. Of course, people came from everywhere to help. They undid the cows, backed them out. They got them down it went out the back door, across the pasture where the Lutheran church is now. That's where Old Nurse connected there, they straightened it to make it more safe coming out, but it used to come out at an abrupt angle. And they walked them, they herded them all the way down to our barn. Dad went ahead, he turned on the electric, he turned on the cooler, the barn lights and so forth. They got the cows in there. And I remember at 10 o'clock at night, they were milking those cows. They brought the milking machines, they brought the big kettles, you know, to put in the cooler. And Jim was there for about 6 weeks, coming in twice a day to milk the cows and so forth. And then when his barn got reconstructed, the cows went back. Yeah, it was something. And I remember the next day going downtown, and Al Dunn's barn was broken and wrecked, but the thing that struck me most, 2 things. One was the side of Guyla's house had been pulled out, and that's directly across from Mill Road. It's a new house now. It was built about, 5, 6, 7 years ago.
No, 10 or 15 years ago.
It was, time flies when you're 90. And, but I remember that the house looked like a dollhouse. It was stunning. The whole side came out, and you could look in and see the bedrooms upstairs, living room and so forth down below. I mean, I couldn't, it was like in another world. And then I remember going all the way downtown, and the thing that again struck me, the second thing was we lost all our big trees. Yeah, that had been, they had been beautiful. And right where I thought of it today, from about O'Neill Drive down, all the way downtown were these huge, beautiful trees. They were wonderful, but they were all turned up, and everybody was starting to cut them up and so forth. But that's what I remember.
Well, thank you.
Anyone else?
I got a footnote.
My name's Susan Verge McGallis, and I am a townie as well, and I grew up on Flanders Road. And I was about 5 and a half when the storm hit. And my brother and I were outdoors. It was warm. It was an odd day. The weather felt odd, but as a kid you kind of. And we were sliding in the grass because the rain was so warm, which was really weird. The sky's getting weird. My mother's all of a sudden screaming, "Get in the house!" So, as kids you say, "What's going on?" So she said, "You have to get in the cellar right now." My dad worked at Bay State, so when that storm came through, I'm not sure if he was working there at the time, was either there or he was working in Worcester, but whatever happened, my mother got news of the tornado coming through, and she whipped us down the cellar so quick. It was like a flash in the pan, and the next thing we hear is this roar, because we could hear it. It wasn't that far from our house, but it was far enough. And after the storm was over, the next day, it was a beautiful day the next day, and my dad took us up the street. Louisa Reddy's farm was completely gone. The barn and all the cows were just gone. There were no cows. And the same with Jack Walkup's farm. And I remember the Cahill's house because I grew up there, and we knew the Cahills. And we thought she was in the bathtub because the bathtub was across the street. Because it did push things out of that house despite the holes in it. The bathtub was across the street. It just, every time I saw that, thank heavens the bathtub is gone because it just reminds me of her dying in that storm. And he rebuilt his house on the corner of Flanders and Washington Street. I don't know if you knew that. But my story's short because I was young and we spent most of that summer in the cellar to begin with. Because every time there was a bad storm, we were in it. The other day, that storm had me looking at the sky. I was waiting for something to come down. I was really waiting for that storm to have a funnel. Anyway, every storm I get a little leery of when it gets like that. So I made it through the storm.
Hi, my name's Bob Thompson, and I just want to add a sequel to what Mike Smith said regarding the Harveys. I interviewed Bob Harvey a number of years ago, part of my role that I used to have, retired now. There's one other piece of information that was kind of interesting. He said he remembers leaving a check. And I don't know if it was from a cow that he sowed or if it was from milk.
I believe it was for a cow.
For a cow, yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
And he had left it on top of the refrigerator. Of course, he thought he'd never see that again. I believe it was a couple weeks later.
Yeah.
It got sent to him from somebody in Jamaica plant. We know people at Blue Hill Observatory, John Conover there, who's an observer there on that day, he started to see frozen leaves come down. Pretty unusual. And then he started to see more debris fall. Now this is a long ways. The tornado itself actually dissipated in Southborough, the last desperate fatal. He then started to see roofing material, and then he started to see sheet metal, large plywood. The debris got bigger and bigger and then go down. And the storm, as it moved offshore, had one of the most impressive lightning displays ever seen in southern New England as well. It was definitely a major supercell of the, as fierce as anything you find in the southern plains, and all the ingredients.
Thank you.
Actually, one more? Yep. One last thing, my father's sign was out front, and they found that in Waltham. You got a phone. They couldn't believe it. The thing was still intact. It said Dorrington Manufacturing. It said the Duncan. So it's, you think back how far that went. And that was not a, good 4 feet by 3 or something, and it made it that far. And it's still intact. So he went down and finally got, it was about 4 weeks later, phone call. So. And like I said, the lines were sparking, the telephone, all the way from, because they wouldn't even let me get near to go out the front door. And I could see it just. Those are little memories, you just start jogging.
You know, when the word got around that it was a tornado, we went, oh, what? We had no clue, other than the Wizard of Oz. That's the only connection we had to a tornado. I mean, where now you see it on television and people have a better feeling for what a tornado is, whether you've lived through it or not. But back then, I mean, that was unheard of here. It just was the Wizard of Oz thing, you know?
One of the areas in Worcester that got hit the hardest was the area of Great Brook Valley. I don't know if you know what Great Brook Valley is. It's, I won't say low income, but it's low income housing, apartments, 3 or 4 stories, and there's several large buildings with a 3 or 4 story and apartments in them. That was notably one of the hardest hit areas. That it came right through there and did a lot of damage, and I don't know how many, but there was a lot of deaths as a result of the tornado did that.
Worcester, I think, had 60.
And a major part of them were in Great Brook Valley.
And the total was 97 for the entire tornado. I'm just going to say one thing. Anyone else? Oh, okay.
Daddy Mello, I have a question that some of you who are around or have family might be able to answer. A former colleague tells the tale of when she was a little girl, her father took the family out of school for a day, and they lived in Fitchburg, and they were coming down to White City Amusement Park. Now, I don't
White
live
City
here, I
Amusement
wasn't
Park.
around at that time.
Oh, yeah.
Can anybody address that?
And it used to be right by the Lake Quinsigamond Bridge.
Yeah, and she said, the sky started to look gray, and my father made us go home early. Not happy.
Good thing.
Yeah, it came through there.
Now, was that totally decimated as a result of the storm, anybody know?
I don't think so.
No?
It wasn't
I went there
mentioned
many,
in
many
all
times.
these.
Oh, you went there after?
Many times afterwards, yeah.
Okay.
It was
12 cents a ride.
Good times.
Those were the days.
My uncle worked there.
We just wanted to say how grateful we are for your coming out tonight and sharing memories of, could have been one of the most devastating things that ever happened to you and to Westborough. And what it did show me when I was reading all about it, what a wonderful community this is, because as those people have said, people came together and helped each other. If your house was gone, you could stay, neighbors would bring you in and let you stay there, or Kirkside, or wherever. I know that kids from Lyman School, 150 boys from Lyman School, and Boy Scouts, and Girl Scouts, and Grange, and all the different organizations just got together and had to cut up all the 4,000 trees. Actually, there was a tree fund to replace those. And people gathered debris, and I remember someone telling me the kids went out into pastures, and Les probably mentioned it too, picking out nails from all the pastures, because the cows and herds could not graze in the pastures that had nails in them. So what it showed me is how the town comes together and how people basically are good at heart, and in a small community like Westborough was, and I'm sure we are now, that if there is a tragedy or a crisis, we'll come together. The world actually is pretty good and kind. Thank you.
Thank you for coming out, and it's wonderful to hear about just what Westborough was like in 1953. All the farms, all the dairy farms, all the farmers that pulled together, and as Kris says, the whole community was very close-knit, and that's really good to know. We're still a caring, loving community. I just want to mention our next events. Tomorrow at 5 o'clock in Memorial Cemetery, we're actually going to dedicate the bench to Nahor Rice, the first person ever buried in that cemetery. He was 5 years old. He was part of the whole Rice kidnapping situation. And we have, together with the Civic Club, we have purchased that bench, and it's going to be dedicated with the Civic Club and the Selectmen and the Select Board and other people present, but certainly the public is welcome to attend. So that's tomorrow at 5 p.m. And then our next program is in conjunction with the library, with Tony Baver from the history librarian. We're going to reprise last year's Crime, Murder, and Mayhem tour of Westborough on October 5th. It's a Thursday. It will take place from 6 to 8 p.m., starting here at the library. You can meet Reverend Parkman in Memorial Cemetery. You can hear about the Rice Boys capture at the high school. You can learn about the hanging of Hugh Henderson in the Midland Cemetery. And you can hear about the baby doll murder at the Central House. And you need to register in advance. And the registration will start September 21st at the library's events website. So the library's calendar of events, and again, it's going to be Thursday, October 5th from 6 to 8. So we look forward to seeing you at any of these events. Thank you very much for coming out. Thank you.